Although I'm going to be discussing my PowerLab 8 that I own and some of my applications, I don't own the company or their intellectual property or anything like that. So on the screen you see the OEM and distributor and some of that information. This is what my basic setup looks like. Small little desk. On the bottom left you have a little 0 to 18 volt up to 3 amp constant current, constant voltage power supply. In the white box underneath the desk is my 14.4 volt 120 amp hour nickel metal hydride battery pack. Right above that are 3 PowerLab 8s. The opening of the desk can be used for cell testing and so forth to keep things out of the way. On top of the desk I have a more precise power supply. On top of that is a small independent data logger, and there's another little workspace that I can have other batteries for testing on the top. One of the features of the PowerLab 8 is that it can balance a battery pack up to 8 cells. It doesn't have to do all 8. You could do less, 4 cells or 3 cells if you like. It's a slightly smaller current to do this balancing rate. It only goes up to a balancing of about 3 amps. And you don't have to. You could treat the whole pack unbalanced as just a black and red positive negative. The PowerLab 8 can work autonomously. You will need to buy a power supply in addition to the PowerLab 8 itself. Of course, you'll need a battery pack to connect to, all that kind of normal stuff. The power supply will need to be able to supply enough power to run the PowerLab 8, of course. Since the PowerLab 8 can do up to 1,344 watts, that means that your power supply, in order to be able to meet that load, might have to do as much as 1,700 watts, which is a pretty beefy power supply, if you want to go that high. And if you're using a battery instead of a power supply, then your battery needs to be able to charge or discharge that, depending upon what your test is. One of the nice features of the PowerLab 8 is that it can interface to a computer for changing settings, updating software, logging charge or discharge events or cycles. It's a very nice feature to have. You don't need to use it, but that it can do it is nice. The PowerLab 8 can do a more conventional type of discharge test where it bleeds off the discharge electrical energy as heat into the room through an internal heat sink. When connected to a battery, the PowerLab 8 at about 80 to 90% efficiency will discharge your source battery into your test battery for the charge cycle. One of the really nice features that I like about the PowerLab 8 is the ability for the discharge of the test battery at about 80 to 90% efficiency into the source battery. This allows you to retain about 60 to 70% of the discharge energy to be used to charge on the next charge cycle, significantly reducing the total energy consumption needed for a certain type of test cycle. Multiple PowerLab 8s can be attached to an individual computer. If each one comes in through its own USB port, you can have a separate instance of the charge control program software for each one of them. You could have an individual power source or battery that powers all of them if each one is doing isolated tasks from each other. In expansion channel mode, multiple PowerLab 8s, up to 16 of them, could be connected in a chain with a master and slaves, all coming in through one USB port and one instance of the charge control software. This can be useful for having them all run the same thing at the same time, the same settings and so forth, but you must have the same type of battery chemistry and things like that to consider. If you want to exceed the normal charge battery voltage or cell count for higher series than 8, you would need isolated power supplies for each individual PowerLab 8, whether they be separate batteries or separate power supplies. And you could then run each one either expansion channel or individual USB charge control software running in the computer for each of those instances. Ultimately, the limit being the processing power ability of the computer, not the PowerLab 8s, which could be run individually each one. You'll see here at the bottom middle a jumper connecting two battery packs at the plus of one and the minus of the other, completing that series string and the two PowerLab 8s overlapping in that series. If you're trying to connect multiple PowerLab 8s in parallel to a single battery, then for testing purposes, similar to the series connection, you have the isolated power supplies or batteries need to be concerned with, still the same computational limits connected to a computer, or each PowerLab 8 operating manually on an island of itself. The additional thing for paralleling is the constant voltage phase for charge or discharge. The currents may not be evenly exactly distributed among all PowerLab 8s. If I say, for instance, wanted to do 90 amps, since each of my three PowerLab 8s can do up to 40 amps, that shouldn't be too much of a problem, but it doesn't mean that all three will see 30 exactly. I may have one that's 29, one that's 31, and one at 30. The difference could be even bigger. It could be one's at 20 amps, one's at 40 amps, and the last one at 30, and mixes thereof. Although each PowerLab 8 will be recording and monitoring its own amps, just be aware that the amp load may not be exactly evenly distributed among all your paralleled PowerLab 8s in this fashion.